Seton Hall and TCU. We had a little bit of a delay on this one, but Seton Hall eventually gets posted in some spots as a 1-point favorite. Other spots picked, but Seton Hall -1, the dominant number, and that's the dominant number now. One with a total of 129.5 or 130. Seton Hall the favorite here. And TCU is an interesting team, all because when you look at their overall resume and what they were able to do this year, there's some pretty high highs and some pretty low lows for this team. The highs for this team, namely beating Texas and Kansas, Texas Tech and Kansas, back-to-back games, right? The end of February, the beginning of March, two really good performances for TCU, but then flaming out at the end of the regular season to a team like West Virginia. We also had some injury question marks about Mike Miles. It does seem like he's going to be okay and ready for the tournament, but we'll make sure if that's going to be the case. But regardless, Seton Hall 1-point favorite here against the Horned Frogs.
I like TCU here. Jamie Dixon's team has been very battle-tested in the Big 12. I thought the Big 12 and the SEC were neck and neck for the best leagues all year long. They're inconsistent shooting the basketball. Seton Hall, when you look at Willard's team, they look like they should be better than they are from a talent standpoint, but for whatever reason, JVT, they didn't show consistency throughout the season, and I think that'll be the difference in terms of how TCU defense was really impressed in that Big 12 tournament when they were down 18 against Texas at the break, could have folded the tent, come back in the second half against an elite defensive team in the Longhorns, and they get through.
Is that more about Texas or TCU?
I thought it was a combination of both. I think, Texas absolutely was at fault, but I think you have to give TCU credit. When you're down that large of a margin, all it takes is one basket to really halt any kind of comeback. But TCU was able to overcome that, and I think they'll be able to do the same thing here. Boy, I looked at this Seton Hall team. Their best win came back in December when they beat Michigan in Ann Arbor. Since that point in time, they've been so highly inconsistent.
And that win has lost its luster, by the way, right?
Absolutely. And so for me, I'm going to go with the number 9 seed here in TCU.
Interesting matchup to watch. TCU really bad in Big 12 play and offensive efficiency. 96.8 points per 100 possessions. Turned it over on 23.2% of their possessions as well. But one of the things that really saved them, offensive rebounding, grabbed 35.1% of their misses, and there were a lot of misses because they weren't a good offensive team, and you get a Seton Hall team who had some trouble keeping teams off the offensive glass, opponents grabbing 30.4% of their misses against Seton Hall. So TCU looks like, statistically at least, should be able to not have their way, but have success on the offensive glass, which is one of the biggest things that kept them going throughout Big 12 play. So TCU again, 1-point underdog, total 130.5. This is one where I would expect a little bit of a lower scoring game between two teams that are not really good. Seton Hall themselves, by the way, not very good on the interior, 44.3% on 2-point shots in conference play. Houston UAB. We'll start here. Houston 8.5 at DraftKings, 8.5 at South Point, and then opened up 8 over at Circa. Right now up on the screen, Houston laying in the range of 8.5 and 9 with a total of 136 or 137, depending on where you shop for some of your numbers. And so when looking at this matchup, right, to me, the initial thing is, how does UAB handle Houston on the glass? We know what they want to do, right? Yeah. They're a good offensive team, but we're talking about the third best offensive rebounding team in the country. It is put up a shot, grab your miss, and then, of course, get second chance points. Can UAB, that's the first thing I thought of, is can UAB box these guys out and keep them off the offensive glass? Because that's hard for this Houston team.
It's going to be the key here in this matchup. This Blazers team, couple things with them. I like Andy Kennedy as a coach. I think he's done a really nice job. But this team at times, they're reliant on the perimeter a little bit too much for me, and I think that could be a challenge against this Houston team. Remember, the Cougars, they don't shoot the ball well, but at the same time, they can be extremely dangerous. I just look at UAB and I say, okay, this is a solid team. But for me, I just don't think they necessarily have enough consistency on the defensive end to be able to get through this matchup. I think Houston moves on despite their injuries they've had this year. Walker was tremendous throughout the course of the season, winning the Conference Player of the Year. But he's going to have a harder time against this defense getting clean looks. He's a smaller guy. His quickness works in his league. But when you look at a guy who's 5'11", probably closer to 5'9" or 5'10", trying against that Houston team, it's going to be a real challenge here. They were very fortunate to get through Middle Tennessee in that triple overtime game.
Yeah, and so for me, yes, very fortunate in that game. That was a ridiculous game, by the way. So what I was looking at here is, and you kind of alluded to it, if Houston loses this game or if they don't cover this game, to me, it's because of that offense. They shot just 31.7% from three-point range in conference play. They were 10th in free throw rate. They shot 67.8% from the line as well. So they barely got to the line, and when they did, they didn't take advantage of it. So if Houston fails to cover a number like this, it's because the offense really hits the skids, and they're not getting those second-chance points like they want. Because to me, when I watch them, especially last year, it seems like a team that was just a little bit reliant on just put it up, grab your miss, and then see if you can get it back into the bucket.
You're absolutely right. And they can do that when they're more athletic and better against certain teams. And I think in a matchup like this against UAB, they may be able to do that to a certain extent. Buffin's got to stay out of foul trouble if they're going to have a chance. He gets in foul trouble, they're going to be in serious trouble in this matchup. But it's going to be an interesting game. I wish Houston did not have the injuries that they have this year, because I think this is a team that really could have made a Final Four run once again.
Interesting trend for Houston this year. In 6 neutral site games, they are 5-1 straight up and against the spread. Ohio State, Loyola Chicago. What do you make of your Buckeyes here, Maul? Now, the opener, to paint the scene here, Loyola -2, Loyola -1, or 1.5, depending on where you shop. We have now seen this really shift. Loyola just laying 1 or a pick in some spots with a total of 133.
Yeah, I think the Buckeyes are in a little bit of trouble here. When you look at this team, they've really struggled down the stretch. That's been the biggest concern. Yeah, they lost that home game against Michigan, collapsed in the second half. But I thought they had another bad collapse against Penn State in the Big Ten tournament. They get wiped out on the road in College Park against Maryland. We see Iowa come in on a Saturday and beat them by 13. The defense has been the problem for the Buckeyes of late. They've got to get better on that end. If they can do that, they've got a shot against this Loyola team. Valentine's team got off to a terrific start during the regular season in the Missouri Valley, but then down the stretch they faltered a little bit. They did have a nice turnaround in conference tournament. But to me, JVT, I think this team is dangerous. But the question for me is, from a defensive standpoint, who's necessarily going to slow down Liddell? And does Malachi Brandon, who's been dealing with a little bit of an injury, can he be as efficient? I like this Ramblers team. I think it's a complete toss-up. Tough game to call, but if you're taking Loyola, I don't have a problem with that at all.
Yeah, that's where I was looking. Ohio State, you mentioned it, not really impressive. 1-4 straight up and against the spread their last 5 games. Defense, what happened to the defense? Average defensive rating during that 5-game stretch, 115.8. And we're talking about Nebraska and Penn State in those matchups that you mentioned.
Yeah, well, they saw the Buckeyes football team not playing a defense.
Yeah.
They figured, why do we need to?
Yep. What's interesting here, too, Loyola Chicago, I think initial thought, because you remember that tournament run, people might think Loyola Chicago, big front court, all this. This is very much a small ball team, man. Like, they're talking about the tallest defender or tallest player. They only have 2 guys on this roster taller than 6'7", and their starting lineup, we're talking about 6'4" to 6'7" across the board.
Look, if it were last year's team with Clayton Krutwig, I think they would destroy Ohio State.
Yep.
I think without that size on the interior, we saw Kofi Coburn really struggle along with Desunmu in that matchup last year. But to me, this is a pretty good matchup if you're both teams. I think they both have to feel like they can get out of the first round.
Villanova and Delaware here. On paper, a little bit of a mismatch, but I'll say this, from a market perspective, it did seem to open up as a little bit, we'll call it high for Villanova, as high as 17 in some spots. That was DraftKings. We're down to 16 or 16.5 here, and in fact, one shot flashing 15.5 right now.
Yeah, I don't think it's a bad play on the Blue Hens here. I like this Villanova team, not as good as some of the teams in the past. Slater's been terrific, was really the catalyst in that tournament for them down the stretch against St. John's. But to me, I look at this Delaware team. They can shoot the ball well. From the floor, JVT, about 47%. It's actually better than what Villanova is at 44%. But where the problem you run into with Villanova is number 1 in the nation at the free throw line, almost 83% as a team. Those are like NBA stats.
Yeah.
Really impressive in terms of what they can do, whether it's Samuels, whether it's Gillespie, it doesn't make a difference. They can all shoot the ball. Yeah,
it'd be interesting. Dylan Painter and how he performs here. Now, down the stretch in certain matchups, hasn't played a lot of minutes. Last time we saw them play, only played, I think, 10 minutes against UNC Wilmington, but can get out there and get some good minutes against a Villanova team that's somewhat small. So we'll see if Painter can get some minutes. The other matchup that's going to be a lot of fun, Illinois and Chattanooga. One of the bigger discrepancies on the board between the KenPom and then the betting line. Illinois opens up 7.5, a projected 5-point win, according to KenPom's site, which sometimes the betting market really does reflect that a lot, Maul. But from a matchup standpoint overall, too, this seems like it's going to be a fun one because Chattanooga dominant defensively in the SoCon. 99.3 points allowed per 100 possessions, 30.4% allowed from beyond the arc to their opponents in conference play. I think there's a little bit of a, what do you do with a guy like Kofi Coburn? But Silvio De Souza, former Jayhawk, that's down low that can match up with him, gives up a little bit of size. But I would look at this overall. I think Chattanooga could be pretty live here in this matchup against Illinois.
I don't disagree with you. David Jean-Baptiste had that game-winning shot against Furman, was terrific all year long. But, you mentioned De Souza. De Souza only 5th in minutes played on this team.
Yeah.
Hasn't really been effective, and we saw why KU wasn't that worried about whether he came back from an eligibility standpoint.
I just wonder if because you're grasping for size to match up with Coburn, do you get a little bit more in terms of minutes out of him, right?
That's a great point, and I think you will because he's the only guy on that roster that can really at least challenge. And can he stay out of foul trouble with the key for this team? Illinois has been inconsistent. Hawkins, when he gets to the free throw line, inconsistent. We know he can knock down threes. We've seen what Plummer can do shooting the ball, but he has been a little bit inconsistent down the stretch. Got up to a fast start in Big Ten play. For me, it's really going to be about Andre Curbelo. Can he dictate this game and how well he plays? I think it's going to be key whether Illinois covers this game or not.
Yeah, Andre Curbelo has long been, I guess, the goat of the shortcomings of Illinois. At times, he could be a pretty decent player, but at other times, a little wild and out of control. And we saw him at the middle of their loss last time out, Illinois, with a chance against Indiana. Big fast break opportunity. He gets down the floor, but a little too wild and misses a layup. And Curbelo's kind of been hot and cold, and for the most part, he's been kind of cold. You do wonder with the minutes played if maybe you start to see those get cut into because he has been a little bit inconsistent, we'll call it, to be fair.
You're absolutely right, and that's putting it mildly. And, Frazier's another guy who's been on that roster forever. He's going to have to play well if the Illini are going to advance. He can shoot the ball from the perimeter. He needs to do an effective job.
And here's my thing with Illinois. And, a lot of the times when you look at ATS numbers, a lot of people will take them as gospel. For me, when I look at ATS numbers, it's a representation of how the market views you. And if you're covering numbers right, then the market, you're a little undervalued by the market. But if you're not covering those numbers, you're a little overvalued by the market. This is an Illinois team that was 13-18 against the spread this season, only covered 42% of their games. In conference play, they were 9-12 ATS. They're a team that I think the market perceives to be a little bit better, and some of these numbers represent that. Again, when some of the statistical websites project this as a 5-point win, but the line out there is 7.5, it represents that kind of discrepancy that we've seen now at this point. Colorado State and Michigan. Michigan opens up 2.5 or 2, depending on where you shop and look. Right now on the board, Colorado State catching against this team. If I can pull it up, and we got it on the screen too. 2.5 still with a total 140 or 139.5. So I bring this up because these are two teams which I kind of, of course, Michigan, you fall out of love with a Michigan team. I thought they were going to be very good this year and ultimately not. But Michigan, any better defensively, do you think? In Big Ten play, they were 11th in defensive efficiency. Opponents posted a 52.4% effective field goal percentage. They hit 53.1% of their attempts inside. And while Colorado State can be a really electric offensive team, this is the best offensive team in the Mountain West, their offense fell down the stretch. They weren't very efficient offensively here at the Thomas & Mack Center during the Mountain West Conference tournament, and they weren't really covering numbers down the stretch either. So I think these are two teams that I am not really fond of taking on one another in a 6-11 matchup.
I really like Michigan in this one, and no bias there for the Big Ten, but I'm going to tell you the problem is, as good as David Roddy has been, and I think he's had a tremendous career, Stevens has really shot the ball well. JVT, the problem for me is I don't think Roddy, if he's matched up in a situation against Dickinson, he's going to have to live on the perimeter,
Correct.
Which he's capable of doing. But if you go in that post, he's got to shoot over a statue. That is not going to be easy. Hunter Dickinson, I don't think TV does him justice in terms of how big he is until you see him in person. And you look at Diabite in terms of this Michigan team, 6'11", they've got length. That's going to be a problem. This is where sometimes I get concerned on these short lines with some of these mid-major programs against a team that they're probably equal to in terms of how well they've played. Colorado State's been terrific, but I think Michigan could potentially, with their experience with Eli Brooks in that backcourt, I think that could be the difference in this one. I like the Wolverines here.
Yeah, Roddy's an interesting cat because he can operate down low, but he's also a 45% shooter from three. And so do you start to see him pull guys out to the perimeter and more operate like that? He's more comfortable a little bit down low. Actually ended up finishing in terms of individual offensive rating 132nd in the country in terms of individual players. But the change in Roddy's game, and if you start to see him face the basket a little bit more and operate a majority of these times outside, because not only are you talking about the size there for Michigan down low and a Dickinson type, but you mentioned it, Diabate is a very athletic 6'11", right? You can go down the list. There's a lot of good forwards here on this Michigan team that could contain him down low if need be or if they get switched onto him. So, and here's the thing, too, with Colorado State, as I mentioned, like being less than impressed with them all. San Diego State's a good defensive team, but you only scored 58 against them. In the round before that, you took on Utah State. You barely got by them there. You scored 53 against Utah State, who, they're a fine defensive team, but really struggled in an ugly game against the Aggies. And just still, when you talk about some of these results down the stretch for Colorado State, not really covering numbers, being a little overvalued by the market. I like the team, but they haven't been shooting the ball very well. And we haven't even mentioned, they have David Roddy. Isaiah Stevens is a very good guard, too. But you wonder if he gets swallowed up by some of the bigger backcourt plays you're going to see there, too.
Yeah, but I like Stevens' quickness.
Yeah.
He's really got a good, quick release. He can shoot the basketball well. I'm not as concerned about that. But to me, again, it's going to come down to what Roddy does. And by the way, JVT, if Roddy gets in any kind of foul trouble, they're in trouble. And the question is, who's going to guard Dickinson inside? You look in the Big Ten half the time. It's like Bogart himself, against the basket and just getting the layup. It's going to be an interesting challenge here. I thought Colorado State got a bad matchup for them in the first round. I think this is a good team. And I'm not as concerned that they were struggling a little bit in Mountain West. I think San Diego State's terrific. We know that how good they are defensively. Boise State, I'm not going to hold that against them. And then the familiarity of playing against teams twice a year, having seen them for a number of years, I think it makes it a lot easier on opponents when they face off against Medvedev's team.
To your point, too, here, a somewhat small Colorado State team. David Roddy at 6'6" is primarily a front court player. John Tanji at 6'5", Chandler Jacobs 6'3", and their starting backcourt Isaiah Stevens, Kendall Moore, both 6 foot. So a very small team for Colorado State in this matchup against Michigan.
It's going to be tough. And, Dave Ross and I were talking one day, I think it was the Murray State-Florida State game. He bet Murray State, and he goes, I knew I lost my bet when I walked into the arena, and I saw the size of Florida State.
Is it the John Morant one?
Yeah, the John Morant.
Oh, yeah. I watched that. I watched that at the D with Mike Palm. Yeah, we were watching it together. And yes, it's a good memory.
Yeah.
Tennessee versus Longwood. Tennessee opens up 16 at Circus. South Point opened it up 17.5. Right now on the screen, Longwood catching 17 across the board with a total of 132.5 or 133. It's intriguing from a matchup standpoint only from this. Tennessee is a team that is very reliant on their three-point shooting. Them all. On the season, they average 111.4 points per possession or per 100 possessions. They shoot 36% from deep, but they don't really have an inside presence. They get 35.9% of their points, just points, from three-point range, only 46% on two-point attempts, and in SEC play, that dropped to 44%. So if these jump shots aren't falling for Tennessee, I still think they have, obviously, personnel advantage here against Longwood. They should be able to win this on talent and roster and bodies alone. But in terms of covering like a 17, if the shots aren't falling, you could see Longwood stick around in a game like this.
I don't disagree with you at all. The number's a little bit high. Longwood can really shoot the ball themselves from the perimeter, I think 37, 38%. But I would say this, John Fulkerson has regressed a little bit this year for Tennessee, but he's a guy that could be a problem in the post. Very cerebral, 23-year-old senior. He's got a ton of experience, and I think against a team like Longwood, he can be far more effective than he is in some of the SEC matchups. When you're going up against not Obi Toppin, but his brother there at Kentucky, or a Sheboy, or one of these kinds of guys with tremendous length, it's a challenge. Against a team like Longwood, though, I think they can be far more effective. And the other thing with Tennessee, though, if Barnes' team struggles a little bit, their defense is going to keep them in games. This team can defend extremely well. Love the way they played down the stretch. Really dominated A&M today, but I thought A&M was in a tough spot.
Jacob Toppin, by the way, his brother.
Get prepared for all the madness with VEASAN's tournament betting guide, daily best bet emails, plus full access to VEASAN through April 5th for only $19 at VEASAN.com/madness.